At 83 years old, Eleanor Whitmore was still pouring her own tea with steady hands, until her own son quietly moved the cup away from her like she was already losing her mind. That was the moment she realized something far worse than aging had begun. Not illness, not weakness, but removal. By the end of that afternoon, her sons had already decided everything for her. The house she had lived in for decades sold. Her life reduced to a room in a nursing home. Her memories, something to be handled later. They said it was for her safety. They said she was no longer capable. They said she should take only what mattered most. And that was their first mistake. Because what they didn't know, what they never even thought to ask, was what their mother had chosen not to take. They believed they were sending her away with nothing. They believed the house was the most valuable thing she owned. They were wrong. Because hidden behind the walls of that quiet home, protected for decades in silence, was something their father never intended for men who saw everything as a transaction. Something that would force them to choose between what they had already taken and what they were never meant to have. And by the time they realized the truth, it would no longer be their decision to make. Because the woman they thought they had removed from their lives was just getting started. You're here for a reason. Together, we'll reveal what someone tried to hide. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment wherever you're watching. The first time Eleanor Whitmore understood that her sons had already decided her life for her was when Daniel moved her teacup away from the edge of the table as if she were a child. He did it gently. That was the worst part. You'll spill it, mother. It was her kitchen, her cup. Her hand was steady. She had been pouring tea for 60 years without assistance. And yet, there he was, 61 years old in a camel coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent, correcting the position of her china like she was halfway gone. Across from him, her younger son, Peter, kept scrolling through his phone, jaw tight, pretending not to be uncomfortable. They had arrived together on a Wednesday afternoon, with flowers they had not chosen themselves and smiles that belonged at a funeral. Eleanor sat very straight at the head of the table, her silver hair pinned neatly, cardigan buttoned all the way up, one hand resting over the other. The November light through the bay window made the room look colder than it was. Behind her, the old clock on the wall ticked with a stubborn dignity. Her late husband had wound that clock every Sunday for 42 years. After he died, she learned to wind it herself. Daniel cleared his throat. We need to talk about what happens next. Not, how are you? Not, you look tired. Not, we've been worried. What happens next? Eleanor let the silence stretch until Peter finally looked up from his phone. I'm still here, she said. So perhaps you can start by telling me what exactly is supposed to be happening to me. Daniel exhaled, as if patience with her had already cost him something. Mother, this house is too much for you now. There it was, clean, practiced. The sentence had been rehearsed in the car. Eleanor turned her eyes to the window. Outside, the garden had gone bare for winter, but the rose bushes still held their shape. She had planted those with Arthur the year Peter got into college. The stone bird bath near the gate had cracked in one corner, and she kept meaning to replace it, though the birds never seemed to mind. This house, she said quietly, has been too much for me for the last 3 winters, according to you. This isn't funny, Daniel snapped. No, Eleanor said. It isn't. Peter leaned forward at last, palms open in that false peacemaker way he had worn since childhood whenever he wanted to avoid blame. Mom, listen, we found somewhere good, really good. You'll have nurses, meals, activities, people around you all day. You won't be alone. I am not alone now. Daniel gave a short, humorless laugh. You live by yourself in a 6-bedroom house at 83. 5 bedrooms, Eleanor corrected. Your father turned one into a library. You hated the wallpaper." Peter rubbed his forehead. "Mom." She looked at both men in turn. These boys she had carried, fed, defended, buried fevers for, sat in school auditoriums for, waited up nights for. Daniel had Arthur's shoulders and none of his softness. Peter had her own eyes, though he used them differently now, glancing away whenever truth entered the room. "What have you done?" she asked. Neither answered at once, which was answer enough. Daniel reached into his leather folder and slid several documents across the polished oak table. Her own table. The one Arthur had refinished himself one summer when they had no money for a new one and too much pride to admit it. "We've put the house on the market." The room did not tilt. She would remember that later with satisfaction. It should have. A weaker woman might have felt the floor disappear under her. Eleanor merely looked down at the papers, then back up at her sons. "You've put my house on the market." Peter spoke too quickly. "Legally, it's in the trust now, Mum. We told you last year we needed to reorganize everything so there wouldn't be complications if I died," she said. Peter's mouth flattened. "If something happened." "Something always happens," Eleanor replied. "That is the nature of time." Daniel pushed on. "The buyers want a fast close. The facility has an opening next week. Frankly, we were lucky to get one." "An opening?" He ignored the tone. "You'll take only what you need." "The rest can be handled later." "Handled," Eleanor repeated. Peter tried for softness again. "Mom, nobody's throwing you away." At that, she almost smiled. Not because it was funny, but because lies delivered tenderly were always the ugliest kind. The truth came to her all at once, not in words, but in shape. Their urgency, their avoidance, their real estate forms, the facility chosen without her, the decision already made. This was not concern. Concern asked. Concern argued. Concern stayed long enough to hear no. This was disposal. She folded her hands more tightly so they would not see them tremble. "How much are you getting for it?" Daniel named a number large enough to insult memory. They had no idea what this house was worth, not only in money, in life, in years, in the exact height marks in the pantry doorway where she had penciled 2 growing boys, in the burn mark on the kitchen counter from the Christmas Arthur tried to flambe something he had no business flambeing, in the upstairs hallway where she stood all night when Daniel was 10 and struggling to breathe through pneumonia, praying in the dark while steam rose from bowls of hot water. In the front room where Peter told them he was leaving his first wife and expected sympathy he did not receive. A house did not become sacred because it was beautiful. It became sacred because it had witnessed you completely. "I'm not going," she said. Daniel stared at her. Peter looked wounded, as if she had broken some reasonable agreement. "Mother," Daniel said, his voice dropping, "please don't make this difficult." Eleanor lifted her chin. "You have confused age with surrender. We are trying to protect you." "No, you are trying to simplify me." Peter stood and crossed to the window, then back again, already agitated. "What do you want us to do? Keep pretending this is working? Mrs. Doyle found you in the garden last month in the cold without your coat. You forgot your cardiology appointment. You leave lights on. You can't keep up this property, and neither of us can be here every time something breaks." The speech had more truth in it, which made it harder and easier at once. "Yes," Eleanor said, "I am old. Sometimes I forget things. Sometimes I get tired. Sometimes the stairs feel steeper than they used to. That is not the same thing as being finished." Daniel's expression hardened. "This isn't a debate. The contracts are in motion. We've paid the deposit." "With whose money?" He did not answer. Her eyes sharpened. "You used my account." "Temporarily," Peter said. "It's all for your care." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, then at Daniel. a terrible calm settled over her, the kind that comes when pain burns past panic and reaches clarity. "So that is who you are." Peter flinched. Daniel did not. "We are your sons," Daniel said, "and somebody has to act like adults." For the first time that afternoon, anger moved visibly through her. Not loud, not theatrical. It straightened her spine further. It put steel into her voice. "I was an adult when I buried your father with $40 in my purse and 2 children still depending on me. I was an adult when I sold my jewelry to keep this house through the recession your father never lived to see. I was an adult when both of you came back to this table with your failures and your debts and your divorces and your pride, and I fed you before I asked questions. Do not sit in my kitchen and introduce yourselves to me as adulthood." Peter's face reddened. "That's not fair." "No," Eleanor said softly. "This isn't." Daniel rose then, collecting the folder, all civility burned away. "The car from Briar Glen is coming Monday. Pack clothes, medication, personal items, whatever matters most." Whatever matters most. It was such a careless sentence that for one absurd second she nearly laughed. If they had known what mattered most, they would not have been standing there. Peter picked up the flowers from the counter, realized too late he had forgotten them, and set them back down awkwardly. Cheap lilies. Funeral flowers, after all. At the door he turned. "Mom, once you settle in, you may actually like it there." She met his eyes. "And once I'm gone, you may actually miss having a mother." Neither son spoke. Daniel opened the door. Cold air moved through the hallway. Then they were gone. The house changed after that. Not physically. The same clock ticked, the same kettle hissed, the same draft touched the landing outside the guest room after sunset. But every room seemed to be listening now, waiting to see what she would do. Eleanor remained at the kitchen table until twilight thickened the window glass into a dark mirror. When she finally stood, the ache in her knees was sharp enough to make her pause. She did not cry. She was too old to mistake tears for action. Instead, she walked upstairs to the room at the end of the corridor where Arthur had kept his desk. No one entered that room without reason. After his death, she had preserved it not as a shrine, but as an agreement. Some things would be handled when the right moment came, not sooner. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. Moonlight from the side window touched the desk, the leather chair, the cabinet built into the wall. Eleanor crossed to the cabinet and knelt with effort, pressing her fingers beneath the lower shelf until they found the hidden latch. Arthur had installed it 50 years earlier with a smile and no explanation. She learned the explanation 2 decades later, on a spring night when his face looked unusually grave and he said, "If the boys ever become men of appetite instead of men of character, promise me you won't save them from themselves." Inside the compartment lay a sealed packet, a key, and a narrow blue ledger wrapped in cloth. Eleanor rested her hand on the ledger and closed her eyes. "They think they've left me with nothing," she whispered into the stillness. Then she opened her eyes, calm and bright and cold as winter light. "They should have checked what I was keeping." She did not open the ledger that night. Instead, Eleanor closed the compartment, returned the latch to its invisible place, and stood slowly, letting her knees catch up with her resolve. There was a sequence to things. There had always been a sequence. Panic first, if one was weak. Action first, if one intended to survive. She chose action. By morning, the house no longer felt like something being taken from her. It felt like something she was preparing to leave on her own terms. She moved through each room with a deliberate, almost ceremonial calm. Not packing everything, that would have meant surrendering to their version of the story. Instead, she chose a small suitcase, 2 dresses she still liked, Arthur's old watch, which no longer worked but still ticked in her memory, a framed photograph of the three of them at the lake, taken before either boy learned how to calculate advantage. In the kitchen, she stood for a long moment, fingers brushing the edge of the table. "You did well," she murmured, not to herself, but to the life that had been lived there. By Sunday evening, the house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not abandonment, completion. Monday came exactly as Daniel had promised. The car from Briar Glen arrived at 10 in the morning, a clean, polished vehicle with a driver who wore kindness like a uniform. He did not ask questions. He simply took her suitcase, offered his arm without insistence, and waited while she locked the front door one last time. Eleanor did not look back. Looking back would have suggested doubt. The nursing home was everything they had described and nothing they had meant. It was clean, efficient, smelled faintly of disinfectant and overcooked vegetables. The staff spoke in softened voices, as if everyone inside had already drifted halfway out of the world. Her room was small but not unpleasant. A narrow bed, a chair by the window, a dresser with more drawers than she would ever fill. The window overlooked a courtyard where two women sat side by side without speaking, their hands folded in identical stillness. "You'll settle in quickly," the nurse said, smiling. Eleanor returned the smile with perfect politeness. "I always do." The first few days passed in observation. That was her gift. It always had been. She observed who spoke to whom, who avoided eye contact, who still had fight left in them, and who had already folded into quiet surrender. She noticed the staff member who lingered an extra moment with certain residents, the man down the hall who pretended not to hear his daughter when she spoke too loudly, the woman who still dressed carefully each morning, even though no one visited. And she noticed something else. No one here was truly poor. Not in the way her sons imagined. They had been stripped, yes, of homes, of independence, of authority over their own lives. But what remained in some of them was sharper than money. It was memory. It was judgment. It was the long view of time that younger people mistook for weakness. On the fourth evening, she asked for paper. Not the flimsy kind used for notes, proper paper. The nurse hesitated, then brought it. Eleanor sat at the small desk by the window and began to write. Her handwriting was steady, elegant, untouched by age in its precision. She did not rush. Every word was chosen the way she had chosen what to pack, only what mattered. The first letter went to an attorney. Not Daniel's, not Peter's, someone else entirely. Arthur had believed in preparation, not trust. Years before his death, he had insisted on setting certain things in motion quietly, beyond the reach of convenience and assumption. Eleanor had not questioned him then. She understood him now more than ever. She wrote the name carefully, then the address, then the request. When she finished, she folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it on the desk. The second letter took longer. This one was not business. This one required something more difficult than clarity. It required restraint. She addressed it to both her sons. She did not accuse, she did not plead. She did not explain herself in ways that would invite debate. Instead, she wrote something far more unsettling. She wrote truth without emotion. By the time she sealed the envelope, the room had grown dark. The courtyard lights flickered on below her window, casting long shadows across the stone paths. Eleanor leaned back in the chair and allowed herself a single, quiet breath. It had begun. Daniel did not expect the letter to matter. It arrived 3 days later, forwarded from Briar Glen. He opened it in his office between meetings, scanning it with the distracted impatience of someone used to controlling outcomes. Halfway through, he stopped. Peter received his copy that evening. He called Daniel within minutes. "What is this?" Daniel did not answer immediately. "What do you mean, what is this?" he said finally. She's talking like," Peter struggled to find the right word, "like she knows something." A pause stretched between them. Daniel's voice sharpened. "She doesn't know anything. There's nothing to know." "Then why does this feel like—" Peter lowered his voice, though he was alone. "Like a warning?" Daniel exhaled hard. "It's manipulation. She's upset. She's trying to make us feel guilty." Peter did not sound convinced. "You didn't see the way she wrote it. I read the same letter you did." "No," Peter said quietly. "You didn't read it." Silence again. Daniel turned the paper over in his hand, as if the answer might be written somewhere between the lines. "She mentions Dad," Peter added, "specifically. And that room." Daniel's jaw tightened. "That room has nothing in it." "Are you sure?" "Yes." "You haven't been in there since—" "I said I'm sure." But even as he spoke, something old and faint moved in the back of his mind. A memory of his father closing the door with unusual care, of conversations that stopped when either son entered the hallway, of a tome Arthur Whitmore rarely used, reserved for things that were not to be discussed. Peter spoke again, slower now. "She said we should check what she chose not to take." Daniel looked up sharply. "What?" "That's the line, at the end. You don't remember it?" Daniel's grip on the paper tightened. "I remember," he said. But now he was no longer scanning the letter. Now he was reading it. And for the first time since they had made their decision, a thin, unwelcome crack appeared in his certainty. Eleanor slept well that night. Not because she was comfortable. The mattress was thin, the air carried unfamiliar sounds. The hallway light slipped beneath her door in a pale line that never fully disappeared. She slept well because something had shifted. For the first time since her sons sat in her kitchen and decided her future without her, she was no longer reacting. She was leading. Morning came quietly. She dressed with care, choosing one of the dresses she had packed not out of necessity, but out of preference. A small act, almost invisible to anyone else, but to her it meant everything. At breakfast, she took her usual seat by the window. Across from her, the woman who always dressed neatly looked up and offered a small nod. Eleanor returned it. "Good morning," the woman said. "Good morning." They ate in silence for a few minutes before the woman spoke again. "You're new?" "Yes." The woman studied her for a moment. "You don't look like you plan to stay." Eleanor allowed herself the faintest hint of a smile. "I plan to finish what I started," she said. The woman raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ambitious for this place." Eleanor set down her cup. "Ambition has nothing to do with location," she replied calmly. "Only with intention." Outside, the courtyard remained still. Inside, something had already begun to move. And far from Briarglen, in a house that no longer felt entirely secure, two men were about to discover that what they had taken was not nearly as important as what had been left behind. Daniel went back to the house that evening. He told himself it was practical. The realtor needed final confirmations. The staging company had questions. There were still things to sort through before the closing date. But as he unlocked the front door, the silence inside did not feel like progress. It felt like something waiting. The house was already beginning to look unfamiliar. Furniture had been shifted, personal items removed, surfaces cleared in ways that erased presence rather than improved it. The life that had filled the rooms was being thinned out, reduced to something easier to sell. Peter arrived 10 minutes later, his car pulling up too fast, tires crunching against the gravel with unnecessary force. "You came," he said, stepping inside. "You told me to," Daniel replied. Peter shut the door behind him, glancing down the hallway as if expecting someone to be standing there. "She's not here," Daniel said flatly. "I know that." "Then stop acting like she might be." Peter ran a hand through his hair. "That letter wasn't normal." "No," Daniel said. "It wasn't emotional enough." "That's exactly the problem." They stood in the entryway longer than either of them wanted to admit. neither moving deeper into the house until Daniel finally exhaled sharply and turned. Fine, let's just check it. They walked down the hallway together, their footsteps echoing in a way that had never happened before. Doors stood open now, stripped of privacy. The living room looked staged already, neutral and empty. The kitchen felt smaller without the clutter of actual living. At the end of the corridor, the door to Arthur's study remained closed. Peter stopped a few feet away from it. "Did you ever go in there after he died?" Daniel shook his head. "No reason to." Peter let out a short, humorless breath. There was always a reason. We just weren't invited. Daniel reached for the handle and paused. For a brief, irrational second, he expected it to be locked. It wasn't. The door opened easily. The room looked exactly as it always had. Desk in place, chair tucked neatly beneath it, shelves lined with books no one had touched in years. Dust lay lightly across the surfaces, but not enough to suggest abandonment. Eleanor had maintained it. Of course she had. Peter stepped inside slowly, turning once as if orienting himself. Feels the same. Daniel moved to the desk, opening drawers with quick, efficient motions. Papers, old receipts, pens that no longer worked, nothing that explained anything. "See," he said, "there's nothing here." Peter wasn't listening. He had crossed to the wall cabinet, running his fingers along the edges, pressing lightly in places without quite knowing why. "She said check what she chose not to take," he murmured. Daniel closed the last drawer harder than necessary. "And? She left most of the house. That doesn't mean there's a secret hidden in every corner." Peter pressed again, slower this time. Something clicked. It was soft, almost nothing, but in a silent room, it sounded like a door unlocking. Daniel froze. Peter stepped back instinctively as a narrow section of the cabinet shifted inward, revealing a concealed compartment neither of them had known existed. For a moment, neither moved. Then Daniel stepped forward and opened it. Inside were three things: a sealed envelope, a ledger, and a key. Peter swallowed. "Well, that's not nothing." Daniel reached for the envelope first. It was addressed in Eleanor's handwriting. "To be opened only if you chose to remove me from my home." Daniel's hand tightened slightly. "She planned this," Peter said quietly. "No," Daniel replied, though his voice had lost its certainty. "She prepared." He broke the seal. The letter inside was short. That was what made it worse. "You always believed this house was the most valuable thing I had. That belief has now cost you something far greater. Everything you need to understand what you've done is in your father's ledger. The key belongs to what remains. Do not mistake ownership for control." "Mother." Peter let out a slow breath. "I don't like this." Daniel ignored him and picked up the ledger. It was heavier than it looked. Bound in worn blue cloth, edges softened by time. When he opened it, the first page was dated decades earlier. Arthur Whitmore's handwriting filled the pages. Precise, methodical, not sentimental. Records, properties, accounts, investments. But not in their names, not in Eleanor's name either. Daniel flipped faster, scanning, then slowing as the pattern emerged. "These aren't small," he said. Peter leaned in. "What do you mean?" "These aren't side accounts. These are structures." Daniel's voice dropped. "Trusts, holdings, long-term positions. He built something." "How much?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He turned another page, then another. Numbers accumulated in a way that made context difficult to grasp all at once. Not one asset, not one account. A network, quiet, layered, designed not to attract attention, designed to last. Peter stepped back slightly. "Why didn't we know about this?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Because it wasn't ours." The words settled heavily between them.
Peter looked toward the compartment again, then at the key lying inside. "What's that for?" Daniel picked it up. It was old, solid, deliberately made. Not decorative, functional. There was a small tag attached. No address, just a name. Whitmore Storage Trust, Unit 7. Peter blinked. Storage? Daniel closed the ledger slowly. "No," he said.
"Not just storage." Eleanor was in the courtyard when the call came. She had begun walking there every afternoon, slow, measured steps along the stone path, hands clasped behind her back. The air was cold but clean, the kind of cold that reminded you that you were still capable of feeling something sharp. Her phone vibrated once in her coat pocket. She did not rush to answer it. She let it ring a second time, then a third, before finally taking it out. Daniel's name on the screen. Of course. She answered calmly, "Yes?" There was no greeting on his end, no attempt at softness. "What is this?" he demanded. Eleanor continued walking. "You'll need to be more specific. The ledger, the accounts, the..." He stopped himself. "Why didn't you tell us?" She paused near the bench but did not sit. "Because you never asked the right questions." Peter's voice came on the line, slightly distant. "Mom, this isn't funny. This is serious." Eleanor allowed a small breath of amusement. "Yes," she said, "it is." Daniel cut in. "We need to talk about this in person." "No." The word landed cleanly. "You don't get to dictate." "I already did," she replied, her voice quiet but immovable. "You simply didn't notice at the time." Silence. For the first time, they were the ones adjusting. Peter spoke again, more cautiously now. "What is the key for?" Eleanor looked up at the pale winter sky. "For what your father chose to leave untouched until it mattered." "And now it matters?" She turned slowly, her gaze moving across the courtyard, the other residents, the quiet, contained world they all inhabited. "It mattered the moment you decided I didn't." Daniel's voice hardened. "You're making this unnecessarily complicated." Eleanor's expression did not change. "No," she said, "I am making it precise." Another silence, heavier this time. Then Daniel spoke again, slower. "What do you want?" Eleanor smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, simply with the certainty of someone who had already moved beyond negotiation. "I want you to understand something," she said. "And then?" "And then," she continued, her voice steady, "I will decide what you deserve to keep." The line went quiet, not disconnected, just empty of words. Eleanor ended the call herself. She returned the phone to her pocket, then finally sat on the bench. For a long moment, she simply breathed. Not as a woman who had been abandoned, not as someone waiting to be rescued, but as someone who had been underestimated and had no intention of correcting that mistake too early. Daniel did not sleep that night. He sat in his study with the ledger open in front of him, the pages no longer blurring into numbers, but arranging themselves into something far more dangerous: meaning, structure, intention. This was not an accident, not a forgotten inheritance, not a lucky oversight. Their father had built this deliberately, quietly, over decades, and he had kept them out of it. By morning, Daniel understood two things with uncomfortable clarity. First, the value of what they had uncovered was far beyond the house they had just sold. Second, they did not control it. The storage facility sat at the edge of the industrial district, the kind of place most people never noticed unless they had reason to. Rows of identical units, security cameras, a gate that opened only with proper authorization. Daniel parked with more force than necessary. Peter arrived moments later, stepping out of his car with visible tension. "You brought it?" Peter asked. Daniel held up the key. They approached the office together. The attendant behind the counter was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she missed very little. "Unit 7, Daniel said, placing the key on the desk. The woman didn't touch it. "Name?" "Whitmore." Something flickered across her face. "Of course," she said quietly. She reached beneath the counter and pulled out a file. Not a thin one, not routine. "Before you access that unit," she continued, "there's a document that requires acknowledgement." Daniel's patience thinned. "What kind of document?" "The kind your father insisted on." Peter shifted beside him. "What does it say?" The woman opened the file and turned it toward them. "Access to Unit 7 is conditional. Entry constitutes agreement to the terms outlined within." Daniel scanned the first page, then slowed, then read it again. "This is ridiculous," he said. Peter leaned closer. "What?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pushed the paper toward him. Peter read. His face changed. "What the hell is this?" The woman spoke calmly. "It's exactly what it looks like." Daniel's voice hardened. "He can't enforce something like this." "He already did," she replied. "Years ago." Silence stretched between the brothers. Peter read the clause again, slower this time, as if the meaning might change. It didn't. "If we go inside," he said quietly, "we lose any claim to the house proceeds. And any existing transfers tied to the primary estate structure," Daniel added. The words sounded unreal even as he said them. Their father had anticipated this moment, anticipated them. "You're saying we have to choose," Peter said. The woman met his eyes. "I'm saying your father believed choices reveal character." Daniel let out a sharp breath. "This is manipulation." "No," the woman said. "It's preparation." Peter stepped back, running both hands over his face. "This is insane. We already sold the house. The money's already in motion." Daniel closed the file with a flat, decisive motion. "Then we walk away." Peter looked at him. "Just like that?" "It's a storage unit," Daniel snapped. "Whatever's inside, we already have more than enough. We don't need to play into some posthumous test." Peter didn't respond, because something in him didn't agree. "Or," Peter said slowly, "we find out what he thought was worth protecting." Daniel's eyes sharpened. "At the cost of everything we've already secured?" "At the cost of finding out what we missed," Peter replied. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. For the first time, this wasn't about money. It was about truth. And neither of them was entirely sure which one they feared more. Eleanor was not surprised when they came to Briar Glen the next afternoon. She had expected it. What she had not expected was how different they would look. Daniel still carried himself with control, but it was tighter now, less certain. Peter's usual restlessness had been replaced with something closer to unease. They sat across from her in the small visitor lounge, the same way they had sat across from her in her kitchen. But this time, they were not the ones in control. Daniel spoke first. "We went to the storage unit." Eleanor inclined her head slightly. "Did you go inside?" "No." "Then you didn't go," she said calmly. Peter leaned forward. "Mom, what is this? Why would Dad set something up like that?" Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "Because your father understood something you never quite learned," she said. "And what's that?" Daniel asked. "That inheritance is not about what you receive," she replied. "It's about what you're capable of holding without destroying." Daniel's jaw tightened. "We haven't destroyed anything." Eleanor held his gaze. "You sold the only place that ever belonged to all of us," she said quietly. "Not because you had to, because it was convenient." Peter looked away. Daniel pressed on. "We made a practical decision. You made an easy one. That's not the same thing as wrong." "No," Eleanor agreed. it's worse." Silence settled between them. Peter spoke again, more carefully. "If we give up the house money, what's in that unit?" Eleanor's expression did not change. "What do you think is in it?" Daniel leaned forward now, enough to make this worth it. Eleanor's eyes softened just slightly. "Is that what you believe this is about?" Daniel didn't answer, because even he wasn't sure anymore. Eleanor continued, her voice steady. "Your father left you a choice, not a reward. The ledger shows you what he built. The key shows you what he protected. But neither of those things were meant for men who see everything as a transaction." Peter swallowed. "And if we walk away?" "Then you keep exactly what you've already taken," she said. "And you?" Daniel asked. Eleanor leaned back slightly in her chair. "I keep what you never noticed I still had." They didn't answer her that day. They left with the same silence they had arrived with, but it was no longer empty. It was working. 2 days later, Daniel called. "We're going back." Eleanor did not ask what had changed. She already knew. The attendant did not look surprised when they returned. "Unit 7?" she asked. Daniel nodded. She placed the document in front of them again. This time, neither of them hesitated as long. Peter signed first. His hand shook slightly, but he didn't stop. Daniel followed. The gate opened. The corridor was narrow, concrete walls cool and indifferent. Unit 7 stood at the end, identical to every other door except for the number. Daniel inserted the key. For a brief moment he paused. Then he turned it. The lock clicked. The door opened. Inside there was no clutter, no stacks of forgotten belongings, no random storage. Everything had been placed deliberately. A table, a set of sealed files, and a single wooden box. Daniel stepped forward slowly, the air inside cooler, stiller, as if the space itself had been waiting. Peter closed the door behind them. No one spoke. Daniel opened the box. Inside was another letter. He unfolded it carefully, and for the first time in years, he heard his father's voice clearly. Not as memory, as judgment. Eleanor did not need to read that letter to know what it said. She had been there the night it was written. Arthur had sat at his desk, the same desk now standing in that quiet room at the end of the hall, his pen moving steadily across the page. "They'll think this is about money," he had said without looking up. "It isn't?" Eleanor had asked. He smiled faintly. "Not really." She had watched him for a moment. "And if they fail?" Arthur had set the pen down then, finally meeting her eyes. "Then they were never meant to carry it." Eleanor had understood. Not because it was easy, because it was necessary. At sunset, Eleanor returned to the courtyard bench. The air was colder now, the light thinner. She sat quietly, hands resting in her lap, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. Around her, life at Briar Glen continued in its quiet rhythm. Conversations, footsteps, small routines that marked time without urgency. She didn't look like a woman who had lost everything. Because she hadn't. She had lost a house. She had lost an illusion. What she had gained was far more precise. Clarity, distance, and the final, undeniable understanding that the value of a life is not determined by who claims it when you are no longer able to defend it. It is determined by what remains when everything superficial is taken away. Eleanor Whitmore had been sent away at 83 years old. Her sons believed they had closed her story. They had no idea they had only reached the part where it finally belonged to her again.